Hi everyone, my name is Rosa Fox and this is going to be a screencast of a talk that I delivered at an event called She Codes Brighton Tech in 10, which is part of Spring Forward Festival. And this talk is about getting started building web applications using Ruby on Rails. We've only got 10 minutes, so I'm only going to really scratch the surface, but I'm going to get through as much as I can, and then if anyone does feel inspired to try it out, I've created a very simple web app which you can clone from GitHub and use as a reference. I've called it Spring Forward Events Planner, and the idea is that you can add a new event. If you try and add an event without filling out a field, it's going to give you this validation error. You can then put in the name of an event, so I'll go with She Codes Brighton and 68 Middle Street, where the event was hosted. I can also change the date and the time. I'll add it and it will show up on the page. I can also go in and edit it. That's going to change. And I can also delete it. But even to do something simple like this, there is still quite a lot to get our heads around, so let's get started. To backtrack a little bit, what actually is Rails? Rails is a framework for the Ruby programming language, and it provides you with a set of web app making functionalities already made for you, so you don't have to start completely from scratch every time you make an app. It's based on the idea of convention over configuration. This means putting your code in specific directories depending on what it does, and also following a set naming convention when creating files. This increases productivity and maintainability, and also makes it quite fun because you can get up and running with something fairly quickly. To get started, you're going to need your computer terminal and a text editor. You'll then need to download Ruby and Rails. I've linked to an article on the README for the Spring Forward Events Planner page on GitHub, which is really good for downloading on OS X using Homebrew. If you're using Linux, there's various package managers you can use, and if you're using Windows, I've heard it is a bit more of a headache, but there's something that you can use called Rails Installer, and there are lots of tutorials online. We'll then need to run a command which is going to generate a kind of skeleton of our Rails app. So we simply need to run the command Rails new and then the name of our app. This is going to generate a file structure which we can then open up here in our text editor. Before we can run the local server, we need to run the command bundle install. Bundler is used for package management and it comes shipped with Rails. It's kind of similar to npm in Node, and it allows you to make use of a wealth of open source libraries in your code, which is one of the reasons why Rails is very popular. In Ruby, libraries are called gems, and in Rails we have a gem file. So you specify the gems that you want in your gem file, you then run bundle install, and that's going to get your dependencies for you. We can then run the Rails server, which enables us to view our app locally. To do that, we simply run the command rails s, and then we can navigate to localhost 3000, where we'll see this kind of generic welcome to Rails page. But how do we get from this to an app of our own that we can actually interact with? Rails lets you control the front end and the back end of an application. To do this, it uses the model view controller format. If you haven't come across that before, the process could be that a user could navigate to, in this case, the root URL /events. This will then send a HTTP GET request to the router within the Rails app. This is then going to invoke the index action in the events controller, and in this case it will interact with the model in order to get information from the database, and also invoke a view for the user to look at. To create our model view controllers, we can use things called generators, and this is where we'll run a command in the terminal, and this is going to create a kind of template file in the correct place that we can add more code into. The general consensus on generators is that they are useful while you're learning, but as you get more confident, it's possibly better to create files manually using the naming convention. This is because sometimes generators generate files that you might not want to use in your projects, maybe like a test file for a test that you're not going to run. But for now, we can run the command railsg, short for generate, controller events index, and this is going to create a controller called events with an index action. So it would look like this, but it would be empty. We then need to create a view so that the user's got something to look at on the screen. This would be done in apps, views, events, which is the name of our controller, and then index, which is the name of our action, .html.erb. ERB stands for embedded Ruby, and it means that we can write Ruby code within our HTML views. So this thing with the percentage sign is ERB. If it's got an equal sign, the thing that we're doing is going to show up on the page, and if not, it's going to kind of happen in the background. So in this if statement here, within this variable, we're checking if there's anything in the events database table. If there is, then we're going to show that up on the screen inside a HTML table. And here I am doing render table, and what I'm doing here is rendering a partial. And this again makes use of the naming convention and convention over configuration. So I'm doing render table, then here we can see I've got this file within the events namespace called underscore table, and because it's got an underscore in front of it, Rails knows that this is a partial. So it's basically going to pull this bit of code into our previous view and display it on the page. And the good thing about this is if we wanted to reuse this table in another view within the events namespace, then we could just render it in and it's going to stop us duplicating up on code. So here what we're doing is we've got a collection of all our events stored within this events instance variable, and you may remember that this was defined within our controller action, just with event.all. And then we are iterating over the collection, so with each iteration we're pulling information out of that database column and displaying it on the screen. In order to connect our view and our controller, we need to set up routes, and this is done in config routes.rb. There are a few ways you can do it, but to make use of the Rails way of creating CRUD, create, read, update, delete, web applications, we can use resourceful routes, and resourceful routes already have a HTTP action assigned to them, as we can see here. So if we run the command rake routes in our terminal, we can kind of see a lowdown of how our routes are set up. So for this example with index, we can see that if we go to the root URL /events, this is going to invoke the events index action within the controller. So I've been talking about pulling information from the events database table, but I haven't really talked about how to actually set a database table up. So to do that, what we'd need to do is create a module, and at the same time we can also create a migration. So to do this, we can do Rails generate module event, that's the name of our module, and then here we're setting up the information for our migration. So name, date, time and venue, they're the names of our columns, and then text, date, time and text are their types. So you can also have like string, integer, that kind of thing. This would then create a model, and I've added some validations in there for the form, and we'd also create a migration file. Migration files are responsible for the structure of the database, and you use rake commands in order to run migrations. So rake db migrate is going to create this schema.rb file, and you can kind of think of each migration as being a new version of the database. So this is going to start off with nothing in it, and then each time we run a migration using the rake task, it's going to be updated and kind of gives an authoritative view of the current state of the database. If we wanted to add a column, say like drinks provided, we shouldn't just do t.boolean drinks provided in the schema. We should create a new migration and then run it using the rake command. This is because, as you can see here, it starts with like 2015. Each migration has a timestamp attached to it, so we need those timestamps in order to add to the database and keep the structure. So in Rails we have something really useful called the Rails console. It's kind of similar to IRB in Ruby, but it lets us load our whole code base and play around with it, and it also lets us query the database. And to do this we can use something called active record, and this is the Rails ORM, which means object relational mapping, and this means that instead of writing out SQL queries we can kind of do it in a nicer way. So here you can see I've written event.all rather than select events from events, and it's shown me all of the events that were stored in the database at that time. I've also used event.new down here, and we can see that it has created a new event, but all the fields are set to nil. So I'll show you how we can kind of like complete the cycle and how using event.new allows us to display the events on the page. So the user adds an event and then fills out this form. When you submit a form, the information that you submit is stored within the browser parameters. The user then clicks on this button, and this button is routed to the create action within the events controller, which we can see here. So we've got the browser parameters, and we're passing that into event.new, and this is going to populate the columns with the information that we filled in the form, and then in the view, in that iteration over the collection, we're pulling out that information and displaying it up on the screen. So that was a very quick introduction to Rails, and I appreciate there was a lot to take in, but hopefully if you've never come across it before and you were thinking about giving it a go, you now know what it is and how you'd go about starting out with it. There is more to Rails than just generating stuff. You've got the Ruby programming language at your disposal, loads of open source libraries, loads of APIs you can connect to, and you can add your kind of JavaScript, Ajax stuff in there as well. There's loads and loads of great stuff you can do with it. It's quite accessible for getting started with, and it is a lot of fun, so I definitely recommend it. If you want to start learning more, I'd recommend the Rails documentation, and I've got a few blogs on my website that might also be useful to you as well.